Welcome to the Deep Read, everybody. I'm Mike, and with me, as always, is Emily.
Hey, everyone.
And today we are diving into The Barn by Wright Thompson.
Ooh, this is a good one.
It is, it's one that we've both been looking forward to for a while now.
Yeah.
This book, it's not just a true crime story.
Right.
It's a deep exploration, really, of history and race and the dark legacy of violence in America, all woven around the tragic murder of Emmett Till.
And you know what's so compelling about this book is how Thompson uses the physical space of the barn where Emmett Till was murdered as a starting point.
Yeah.
He doesn't just tell us about the crime.
Right.
He uses it to uncover centuries of history embedded in a specific patch of Mississippi, Township 22 North.
That's what grabbed me right away, too. I mean, most of us know the basics of Emmett Till's story.
Right.
But Thompson pushes us to think, like, why there?
Yeah, why this barn?
Yeah, in this seemingly random spot in the Delta.
Yeah, and to answer that, he takes us all the way back to the land's original inhabitants, the Choctaw Nation.
Wow.
He paints this picture of their complex society and their connection to the land.
Yeah.
And ultimately their forced removal through a series of treaties.
Right.
It's a story of dispossession that really sets the stage for everything that follows.
It really does. It's like Thompson is drawing this direct line.
Exactly.
From the Choctaw removal to the arrival of European settlers.
Yeah.
The rise of the cotton plantations and the brutal system of slavery that took root.
Exactly. And he doesn't shy away from the economics of it all either.
No, he doesn't.
We see how greed for land and profit fueled this cycle of exploitation.
Right.
Setting a pattern of racial violence that continues to resonate today.
Which leads us to the barn itself.
Yeah.
It's almost eerie how this structure built long before 1955 becomes this central character in the story.
It's described as this long, narrow building.
Okay.
With weathered cypress walls and sliding doors.
Like a pretty typical barn.
Just a simple farm building. Yeah. But after the murder of Emmett, it takes on this whole other meaning.
Yeah, it becomes like a silent witness.
Absolutely.
Holding the weight of all those years of violence and injustice.
Mm-hmm.
Thompson even refers to it as like a physical embodiment of that dark history.
He does, and to understand that history, we need to understand Emmett.
Right, yeah.
He wasn't from Mississippi.
Right.
He was a 14-year-old from Chicago visiting relatives during the summer of 1955.
A city kid.
Thompson really brings him to life,
Yeah.
Describing his personality, his close relationship with his mother, Mamie.
He was a city kid. He was nicknamed Bobo by his family.
Yeah.
You can almost feel the culture shock, going from a relatively integrated life in Chicago to the segregated South.
It's almost unimaginable the world he stepped into.
Yeah.
And then there's that pivotal moment at Bryant's grocery.
Right.
Emmett goes into the store and allegedly whistles at Carolyn Bryant, a white woman.
Right. And whether he actually did or not is still debated.
It is, yeah.
But the consequences were immediate and brutal.
Absolutely.
It's chilling how a seemingly small act, maybe even just a misunderstanding, triggered such a horrific chain of events.
From that point, the story takes a dark turn.
Yeah.
Emmett is kidnapped from his great-uncle's home in the dead of night.
Okay.
Taken to that barn we talked about and subjected to unimaginable torture.
It's,
Yeah.
The details of the murder are hard to stomach even all these years later.
They are.
And it makes the trial of his killers, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam, all the more significant.
It does, right, because their acquittal by an all-white jury,
Right.
despite overwhelming evidence, isn't just a legal outcome. It's a reflection of the power dynamics of the time.
Absolutely.
The verdict itself becomes a symbol of the systemic racism that allowed such a horrific crime to go unpunished.
And it ignited national outrage.
It did.
The Emmett Till case became a turning point, I think, in the fight for civil rights. A stark illustration of the injustice faced by Black Americans in the Jim Crow South.
And Thompson digs deeper, too.
Yeah.
He traces the genealogy of the key figures. The killers, the witnesses, even the jurors. He uncovers these tangled webs of family history, revealing how their lives were intertwined long before 1955, further solidifying the sense that this event was deeply rooted in the fabric of the community.
Yeah, it's like he's saying that to understand this one event, this one murder, we have to understand the whole history of this place, of this land, and of the people who lived and died there.
And that history is intricately tied to the history of America itself.
It really is.
Yeah. And it's fascinating how Thompson weaves the physical landscape of the Mississippi Delta into this historical narrative.
Yeah.
You know, he describes the Delta as this incredibly fertile land,
Right.
shaped by rivers and bayous,
Yeah.
yet also scarred by human exploitation.
It's interesting. He even talks about specific trees.
I know.
Like the ancient bald cypress trees lining the bayou near the barn. You imagine these massive trees just standing for millions of years,
Wow.
witnessing the rise and fall of civilizations.
It really puts things in perspective.
Yeah, it does. It gives you this sense of the land as this enduring force, this constant backdrop
Right.
to the fleeting lives of the people who inhabited it.
You have generations of families, both black and white,
Yeah.
who lived and died in Township 22 North.
Mm-hmm.
Their stories entangled with this, cycles of cotton planting, sharecropping, and ultimately violence.
And that's where the barn becomes this focal point.
Yeah.
Like this tangible link between the past and present.
It is.
It's not just a crime scene. It's a symbol of all these larger forces at play.
Right.
The legacy of slavery,
Yeah.
the struggle for economic power, the deep-seated racial tensions that permeated the South.
Absolutely. And Thompson takes us on this journey through history,
Yeah.
starting with the European settlers and their insatiable desire for wealth.
Right.
We see how the cotton industry boomed, built on the backs of enslaved Africans, creating a system of unimaginable cruelty and oppression.
He doesn't gloss over the brutal realities of slavery at all.
No, not at all.
He talks about the financial schemes that fueled the cotton trade,
Right.
the political machinations that kept black people disenfranchised for generations, the sheer dehumanization that was woven into the very fabric of Southern society.
And even after slavery ended, the exploitation continued.
Right.
Thompson highlights the rise of sharecropping,
Oh.
this system that trapped many black families in a cycle of debt and poverty,
Yeah.
further reinforcing the racial and economic hierarchies that define the South.
Yeah, it's like he's peeling back layers of history,
He is.
revealing these interconnected systems of oppression that led to Emmett Till's murder.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a random act of violence.
Yeah.
It was the culmination of centuries of racial injustice.
But it's not just about systems and structures either.
Right.
Thompson also focuses on the human impact of this history. He spends a considerable amount of time exploring the lives of Emmett Till's family, both before and after his murder.
It's heartbreaking to read about Emmett's mother, Mamie Till Mobley,
I know.
and her unimaginable grief.
It is, but it's also incredibly inspiring to see how she channeled that grief into action.
It is.
Her decision to have an open casket funeral for Emmett,
Wow.
forcing the world to see the brutality inflicted upon her son,
Yeah,
was a pivotal moment.
it was.
It galvanized the civil rights movement and made Emmett Till a symbol of the fight for racial justice.
Yeah, it's a testament to her strength and determination.
Absolutely.
That she used her personal tragedy to fuel a larger movement for change. And Thompson doesn't forget about the other members of Emmett's family either.
Right.
Like his cousins who were with him that night in Money, Mississippi.
Yeah, their firsthand accounts add this incredibly poignant layer to the story.
They do.
We hear about their fear, their confusion, and their lifelong struggle to cope with what they witnessed. It makes you realize that Emmett Till wasn't just a symbol.
Right.
He was a real person deeply loved by his family and friends.
Yeah, and their lives were forever altered by his death.
They were.
Thompson explores the ripple effects of that trauma,
Yeah.
how it shaped their choices, their relationships, and their views of the world.
It's a stark reminder that the impact of violence extends far beyond the immediate victim.
Right.
It reverberates through families and communities for generations.
Yeah.
But Thompson doesn't just focus on the black community.
Right.
He also delves into the psychological impact of the murder on the white community in the Delta.
Yeah, he talks about how the trial of Bryant and Malem became this rallying point for white supremacy, further solidifying the racial divide in the region.
He writes about how some white residents, even those who might not have condoned the violence, chose to remain silent,
Right.
becoming complicit in a system that allowed such a tragedy to occur.
It's a disturbing look at how deeply ingrained racism can warp people's perceptions, leading them to justify or ignore horrific acts of violence.
But Thompson also highlights the stories of those white individuals who did speak out against the injustice,
Yeah.
risking their own safety and social standing to do what they believed was right.
Like the sheriff who arrested Bryant and Malem, knowing he would face backlash from his own community.
And the journalist who tried to expose the truth about the case,
Right.
even though it meant jeopardizing his career.
Their courage is remarkable.
It is.
They refused to be swept up in the tide of silence and denial. And in doing so, they challenged the prevailing norms and beliefs of their community.
Yeah.
Reminding us that change is possible.
Yes.
Even in the face of overwhelming opposition.
Their stories offer a glimmer of hope.
They do.
A reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are always those who choose to stand on the side of justice.
Yeah, and that brings us to the present day where the barn itself has become a focal point.
Right.
For remembrance and reconciliation.
Thompson discusses how the barn was rediscovered and how efforts are underway to preserve it as a memorial to Emmett Till.
Yeah.
And a reminder of the ongoing struggle for racial justice.
He talks about organizations like the Emmett Till Interpretive Center.
Yes.
Which are working to educate people about this history and promote dialogue about race and reconciliation.
It's incredibly powerful to think about how this barn, once a site of horrific violence, is being transformed into a place of learning, healing, and hope.
It's, one of the things that really struck me throughout this whole book is the power of silence.
Absolutely.
It's almost like another character in the story.
Thompson talks about how for decades, generations in the Delta, both black and white, chose not to talk about Emmett Till's murder.
It was
as though acknowledging it out loud would make the pain, the horror too real to bear.
But as Thompson points out, that silence itself became a form of complicity.
It did.
By not talking about it. By pretending it didn't happen.
Right.
The community was, in a way, protecting the existing power structure.
Yes.
The very system that allowed this tragedy to occur.
There's this chilling passage where Thompson describes how some white residents, even decades later, still couldn't bring themselves to say Emmett Till's name. They refer to him as that boy or the Chicago boy, anything but his actual name.
It's as if saying his name would force them to confront their own role in the tragedy, their own complicity in the system that allowed it to happen.
Exactly.
It's a stark reminder of how deep denial can run.
Yeah.
How difficult it can be to face uncomfortable truths about our past.
But Thompson also highlights the incredible courage of those who did speak out, who refused to be silenced.
People like Willie Reed.
Exactly.
A young sharecropper who risked his life to testify against the killers.
And Moses Wright, Emmett's great-uncle. Who stood up in court and identified the men who took his nephew. Knowing the danger it put him and his family in.
These were acts of incredible bravery.
They were.
Of moral clarity in the face of overwhelming pressure and fear.
And their voices helped pave the way for the civil rights movement.
They did.
A movement that would ultimately challenge the very foundations of that racist system.
Right. But the fight didn't end there.
No, it didn't.
Thompson also talks about those who came later. The historians, activists, and journalists who continued to dig into the past. To unearth the hidden truths that the silence tried to bury.
People like Patrick Weems, who dedicated his life to preserving the memory of Emmett Till and transforming the barn into a memorial.
And Gloria Dickerson, who worked tirelessly to educate her community about this history, to reclaim the narrative that had been suppressed for so long.
It's inspiring how they refused to let the story be forgotten.
It is.
How they fought to ensure that Emmett Till's death would not be in vain.
And that work continues today.
It does.
In recent years, there's been this resurgence of interest in Emmett Till's case, fueled by the Black Lives Matter movement and a broader reckoning with America's racial history.
Absolutely.
It's led to a re-examination of the evidence, a push for further investigation, a demand for accountability.
Even though Bryant and Milam were never convicted, the truth about what happened to Emmett Till is finally coming to light.
It is.
Forcing the nation to confront the ugly reality of its racist past.
And that's the crucial point.
It is.
Thompson makes it clear that the legacy of Emmett Till's murder isn't just confined to the past. He draws direct parallels between the racial violence of the 1950s and the injustices faced by Black Americans today.
He talks about police brutality, mass incarceration, the systemic racism that continues to permeate our society.
It's a sobering reminder that the fight for racial justice is far from over.
But the barn isn't just a story of tragedy and injustice. There's also a powerful thread of hope running through it.
There is.
The hope that by confronting our past, by understanding the forces that led to Emmett Till's death, we can create a more just and equitable future.
A future where every child, regardless of race, can live without fear.
Absolutely.
A future where the barn itself, once a symbol of hate and violence, can become a space for healing, remembrance, and reconciliation.
That's the ultimate takeaway for me.
It is.
The Barn isn't just a history lesson.
Right.
It's a call to action.
It is.
It challenges us to confront the legacies of racism in our own lives and communities.
Yes.
To work towards dismantling the systems of oppression that continue to inflict harm.
So to our listeners, if you haven't already, I urge you to read The Barn by Wright Thompson.
Yes.
It's a powerful, challenging, and ultimately essential read.
It is.
For anyone who wants to understand the complexities of race and history in America.
And it's not just a book for Americans either. The themes it explores, racial injustice, the abuse of power, the struggle for human dignity, these are universal.
Yeah.
It's a book that speaks to all of us.
It does.
Urging us to examine our own biases,
Right.
our own roles in perpetuating or dismantling systems of oppression.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to hear from you.
We do.
What resonated with you most in our discussion of The Barn?
Yeah, what are your thoughts on the legacy of Emmett Till and the ongoing fight for racial justice?
Leave us a comment on our website.
Yes.
Share your thoughts on social media.
Please do.
Or start a conversation with a friend or family member.
These conversations matter.
They do.
Keeping the dialogue going, amplifying marginalized voices, and refusing to be silent is how we create real change.
Thanks for joining us on this journey through The Barn.
Yes, thank you.
We'll be back next week with another deep dive into a book that matters.
We will.
Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep the conversation going.